So good morning, everyone. Welcome to this session. Um, just by way of introduction, I'd like to say that this isn't necessarily a training event. It's a learning event where we're going to learn from each other, hopefully. We're going to be talking about the medium-term plan, but not in the sense of how to do it, uh, how to do scrutiny, except from a strategic point of view. Where does scrutiny position itself? What are its challenges in the future? So I'm joined by my colleague, Camilla de Bernard-Lane, Director of Practice at CFGS. We're going to take you through this session today. But as Sarah was just saying, we're going to use polls as well to get your input into the session so we can build our own agenda in a way and look at some of the issues which are of concern to you. It's fair to say, though, isn't it? I think we'd all agree with this, that finance for local government is in a very precarious place at the moment. Um, we've got, sorry, my screen is obscured there. We've got this situation that I think is referred to as a VUCA, a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous operating environment for local government, where at the moment we're seeing costs rising for local councils on average across the sector by between 5 and 10% a year. That's quite a growth in the costs that local authorities are trying to deal with. And at the same time, incomes are only rising by grant and council tax, for example, by about 3 to 5% per year. And if you're over 3%, you're doing really well. So you can see that gap building up between costs and income for councils and what that's eventually going to mean in terms of viability of finance across the sector. There are already claims by pretty eminent organisations that are saying that this is unsustainable and the sector, we'll see more councils falling into the 114, the section 114, inverted commas, bankruptcy situation if we're not careful. Investment income from those councils that have investment is highly uncertain, and therefore those spending gaps are rising almost everywhere. There are some fixes. We might call them short-term fixes. There are no sort of long-term solutions to these, which is going to fix the sector for good. Those grants for social care precepts and things like that, which can be added into the council tax, and other grant funding from central government. But they aren't necessarily long-term solutions. We've also seen councils receiving capitalisation directions where they can use sell-off of assets to plug gaps in their budgets. But again, not sustainable and not available to everyone. Not everyone's got, a portfolio of assets that they can dispose of to fill those gaps. We've seen some exceptional financial support. It's arguably not very exceptional. And can it really support local government over the longer term? And we've seen, in a fairly unprecedented way, the use of reserves in councils, where that's always been a no-go area in terms of using reserves to plug gaps. But we are seeing the use of reserves more and more, I think, which is a worrying sign. And then finally, those catastrophic investments by some councils, which have caused them to fall over in a terrible way. Because of circumstances changing and all the rest of it. And we could suggest in that scenario that there's a failure of governance and scrutiny and culture, in a sense, a challenge culture in those councils. So we're in a tricky position, aren't we? So what does this mean, therefore, for the medium-term financial plan for councils? And you're all pretty much going through this. It's a balancing act, starting there at the bottom with the foundations of your medium-term financial plan, which is the assumptions that your council will make, largely economic, what's happening to inflation, what's happening to wage costs, what's happening to interest rates, etc., etc. All those assumptions in which will be the platform upon which your budget will rise. And then we've got to balance these other things. The risks and pressures that your councils face, the pressures, for example, of demographic growth and aging population, more people coming, requiring different forms of housing, risks around all sorts of areas for councils that have got to be identified, ameliorated, and planned for just in case. So that's building. Your income in terms of council tax, where you're going to set that, what are the grants likely to be, what's government intention around grants and those sort of things. Setting your own fees and charges, and that's not inelastic. You can, you can't just charge what you want to charge. There is a demand side of that to think about. And on top of that, you've got those policies that you're trying to deliver, what you're trying to deliver in your corporate plan, the choices that you want to make as a council, the priorities that you want to set. And to achieve some of that balancing, we've got to make some savings usually. We've got to make some efficiencies. We've got to do things differently. We've got to transition services into more efficient operations. So those areas require some thinking about, and certainly require some scrutiny about the capacity to deliver that sort of those savings and those efficiencies. And we've got to ask ourselves, are there more savings actually to be gained from local government, or has it been wrung dry in that sense? But of course, we also want to improve services where we can, and some services do need some improvement. They will need some investment. They will need some resources. They will need some management time to be able to do those things, and they've got to be factored into your medium-term plan. On the balance sheet side, reserves and borrowing, I've already mentioned that some councils have to dip into reserves to balance gaps, and borrowing is becoming more expensive. So the balance sheet side of your council, MTFP or MTFS, will need some thinking about and some scrutiny heads in the game as well. If you're lucky enough to have an asset portfolio that's able to provide some of your capital needs, hallelujah, that's great. But that's becoming difficult, isn't it? Because assets are becoming less valuable. There's arguably a glut of council assets and public sector assets coming onto the market, and some of them are very difficult to sell. If you've got an old Victorian school somewhere, they're not necessarily very convertible and very saleable, marketable. So there are limits to that. And then lo and behold, the last two to lump on top of your already very difficult balancing act is LGR just around the corner. And those of you who are involved in LGR, it's very difficult, I'm sure, to work out what sort of resources, what sort of finances you're going to need to plan to be able to work through the LGR transitional period. I've seen some budgets really shift over the last 12 months and double in some cases because the costs of LGR on councils and the uncertainty as to how that funding is going to be met. And then just around the corner for all of us, there is fair funding review. So it's going to be pretty difficult in terms of balancing that, because there are going to be winners and losers, and everybody knows there are going to be winners and losers. We've seen recent debate in the last few weeks about how this is going to impact upon the more rural areas in the sort of Midlands and North compared to the more urban areas, and perhaps in parts of the South, London, for example. And now the balance of fair funding might have just shifted slightly. We wait to see. I think we're likely to see something over the next few months. I think a date's been set provisionally for that. So there we have it. That's where we're at, folks. It's complex, it's challenging, it's even more challenging, and there's lots of change in the post.